Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. The current state of the racing genre. What can I possibly say about it that hasn't been said already? It's clear that many people have become disenfranchised with modern racing games, a narrative which I definitely haven't contributed to in any way. But let's be honest, you know it's not great when a mod for a 20-year-old game has generated more excitement than anything that series is currently doing. How we got to this state of affairs is something that many have tried to decipher, but the truth is that for every game and franchise, the story is always going to be slightly different. Even still, I do think there are some clear negative trends that we can observe, and one that's become very noticeable centers around an element that previously was only seen as a positive. Online gaming has been around for a long time, longer than most people think, but it wasn't until the early to mid-2000s that it became widespread. It allowed people to enjoy games in a totally different way, adding a new dimension for both casual and competitive players. But when we talk about online gaming, we're not just talking about player interaction. Internet connectivity has changed gaming in many ways, more than you probably realize. It influences so many design decisions that developers make, and often not in ways that benefit the players or the games themselves. The racing game genre has been hit particularly hard by this in recent years, but for every major controversy we see, there are numerous other smaller cases that go almost entirely ignored. Really, it's a problem that goes a lot deeper than often gets talked about, and today I'm going to try and get to the very core of the problem. But before we delve into how online integration is making racing games worse, I think it's important that we talk about how it makes them better, at least in theory. You see, in the past, when a game was released, it was a one-shot deal. As the game couldn't be updated, it would continue to exist in that exact same form until the end of time. This meant that developers had only one shot to get it right. And if they didn't, the effects of that would always linger. A great example is with Gran Turismo 2. It's quite well known that this game was rushed to meet the Christmas 1999 deadline, and as such, its original release was plagued with numerous bugs and oversights. In fact, it was so bad that Sony had to issue replacement copies with a patched version of the game. This wasn't a common practice at the time, and was certainly nowhere near as convenient as today's online patches. And even now, GT2's reputation is still slightly tainted by this, even if its issues were nowhere near as egregious as some more recent titles. But not only do online updates allow games to be retroactively fixed, but also to increase in size and scope. Post-launch content is a very common thing to see in modern racing games, bringing new cars, locations, and even features. This means that games can continue to evolve after release, adding new and interesting things to keep the experience fresh. Back in the 2000s, when this sort of thing was just starting, this was the future we were promised. But with hindsight, we now know that things didn't turn out exactly like that. Because instead of using this ability to make their games better, some companies saw it as an opportunity to put in less effort while still reaping the same rewards. It became a lot more common to see games be rushed and then released in a broken and unfinished state. Then, with updates, the game would be gradually improved over time, fixing issues that should have never been seen, and adding content that should have already been there. However, whilst this plague has afflicted many racing games, it's not specific to them. In pretty much any genre, you'll find publishers trying to cut the same corners. This is one of the more obvious complaints when it comes to how the online era has affected these games. But whilst we're covering the low-hanging fruit, we might as well mention Always Online DRM. The requirement to always have an online connection to play a game has pretty much never been a popular choice. For as long as it's existed, there's always been pushback. And in the realm of racing games, things are no different. Need for Speed 2015 was criticised heavily for this at the time, and to EA's credit, they at least responded by not doing it again in any future Need for Speed games. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for Gran Turismo. 2017's Gran Turismo Sport was the first game in the series to require a constant online connection, even for single-player modes. And despite the predictable backlash, Polyphony doubled down with Gran Turismo 7 in 2022. This made even less sense given how GT7 was billed as a successor to the older games where the single-player campaign plays a major role. So why is Always Online DRM even a thing? Well, the official line has always been to prevent people from playing these games illegally, such as with pirated copies, although in most cases it doesn't really work. When quizzed on this prior to GT7's release, series producer Kazunori Yamauchi stated that the main reason for the constant online connection was to prevent players from cheating by modifying save data. Now sure, that is a benefit from their point of view, but it's hard not to feel like there are other solutions to this problem that don't disadvantage everyone else. GT7 is a great case study for this, because we witnessed the worst case scenario. Just a couple of weeks after the game released, it was rendered mostly unplayable for an entire day when the servers went offline. This was due to a major issue found within an update, meaning that another update had to be quickly rolled out to fix it. Combine this with the game receiving major backlash at the time for its unfair economy, and it all adds up to possibly the darkest day in the series' history. Ultimately, why always online mandates are so unpopular is because they offer no benefit to the players. They can only take away from the experience. But despite that, they continue to appear in various games, many of which featuring predominant single-player modes. For many, it's a major issue with modern gaming, but we're only just scratching the surface. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of this topic is how online integration has affected game design, because it used to be the case that these games were entirely self-contained. The experiences you had in their single-player campaigns weren't affected by any external sources. They were designed to function entirely on their own merits. This gave rise to racing games that I guess we would now consider as traditional in design. They were complete experiences that you could play from start to finish, featuring a natural progression curve and satisfying conclusions. For example, winning the final championship or final race. But in more recent times, this model has seemed to fall out of favour. This is where we need to approach the idea of games as a service. Also known as live service games, this is a style of game that takes the idea of constantly adding new content through updates and bases its entire design around that to keep people playing it for as long as possible. The point is that rather than the game being designed as a complete experience, it's left open-ended so that it can be expanded on further down the line. As such, these games have no definitive endpoints, and no matter how much they add to them, they never will. Again, this is an idea that has existed in the gaming space long before they were first seen in the racing genre, but as their popularity grew throughout the 2010s, they became more prominent. It's a big deal, but not every franchise can follow the same model. One of the risks with live service games is not having enough concurrent players to justify them existing. This is something we've seen quite a lot recently. Games that don't meet expectations when it comes to player interest, and so are killed off much sooner than anticipated simply because it isn't worth developers investing any more time and resources. It's not a coincidence that Gran Turismo and Forza, two of the largest racing game franchises out there, are also the two most notable examples of live service racing games because, at this point, they're simply too big to fail. They have such a large amount of the market share that there will always be interest in their games. But for more niche series that don't have such a large player base, it represents too much of a risk. However, even within racing games that don't fully commit to the live service model, we can still find live service elements. Think about the ubiquitous Season Pass. The goal is to get players invested in the game in the long term by dangling the carrot of what's to come, even if they're not really satisfied with its current state. This is something that pretty much every major racing game franchise tries in some way. So that's a fairly objective view on the current racing game landscape. But what do I think personally? Now, don't get me wrong, I think the idea of a game evolving over time and adding new things to the experience is really cool, but none of it comes at the cost of the inherent quality of the base game. For me, this is where pretty much every one of these games falls flat on its face. Gran Turismo 7. I've already talked about it ad nauseum, but it really highlights this point perfectly. Its single-player campaign is a joke. A series of repetitive tasks laid out sequentially with no opportunity to explore or strategize like you could in the games that it supposedly harks back to. But the final nail in its coffin is how it ends, or rather, how it doesn't. Yes, there is technically an endpoint by way of completing the final championship, but it really is just a token ending. There's no build-up to it, it's just suddenly sprung on you in one of the menu books. And it doesn't even make sense for it to be the final championship, considering the performance of the cars you have to drive, and that there are much faster ones which don't get used anywhere in the career. There's no sense of finality, it's just a place to put the credits and nothing more. But not to worry, because this was all part of their plan. Through updates, we would see them expand the game with more events, including ones for the higher end cars that should have already been there. But because the main career is already defined, all they can do is tack the new stuff on the end. As such, it never feels truly satisfying. It's just a very disjointed experience. And when you consider how there are much easier ways to earn money beyond these races, they don't factor into the progression loop at all. It's just stuff to do. There's no inherent meaning to these races like there were in the older games when they were all part of one cohesive single-player experience. And it all comes back to the live service aspect. There is no end goal because there can't be, so anything they do add further down the line will always feel kind of pointless. I mean, I have more than 20 million credits and most of the cars in the game, so why would I care about this random event they just added for Mitsubishi Evos? Sure, it does give these cars a little bit more purpose, which is always a good thing, but at this point, it's just content for the sake of content. Now compare this to if this event had been in the game from launch. From there, it could have factored into the progression in a meaningful way, serving as a stepping stone on your journey deeper into the career. And the most frustrating thing is that's how it used to be in the older GT games. This is a principle that these games were built on innately, but because of GT7's live service model, it's like they've just forgotten basic game design. It's infuriating. And trust me, I wish GT7 were alone in this, but it's really not. Forza Motorsport made its long-awaited return last year. Now you would think that having observed the GT7 situation from afar and seen the criticism the game received for its lackluster single-player, that Turn 10 would be wise enough to focus on this area and really capitalize on Polyphony's mistakes. But they didn't do that. Instead, they managed to create a single-player career that fails in many of the same ways as GT7's. Overly restrictive, doesn't make full use of the game's content, and isn't all that satisfying to play through. But it's okay, because they'll continue to add more with the updates, and the cycle goes on. There's no doubt that both GT7 and FM8 are now in much better places than they were at launch, but their over-reliance on drip-fed content limits what they'll always be capable of. And this model also negatively affects how any new content is perceived. Take GT7's October update as an example. It's fair to say that many people weren't all that impressed with the 3 vehicles they chose to include. The fact that all 3 were slightly different versions of vehicles we already have obviously didn't help, and many were quick to voice their displeasure, particularly about the van. However, I strongly believe that the issue with this update is not inherent to the content itself. The issue is the fact that GT7, 2.5 years into its lifespan, is still dependent on updates to bring interest back to the game for most people. That statement alone paints a fairly concerning picture for the state of the game, because it tells you that it still lacks substance. Now of course, regardless of what state the game is in, you'll always have people complaining about the choice of new content, but I can guarantee that if the game were in a better position overall, there would be far fewer complaints than what we see now. If people were actually happy with the game as it is, a single dud update wouldn't make any difference. And that is the problem with this live service model. If a single update that adds 3 cars, a handful of races, and some new engine swaps is what the current public opinion of the game hinges entirely on, just how uninteresting is the rest of the game that's already there? And that is why, no matter how much they add to these games, they will never be truly great. The structure and how this affects the way we interact with them as players will always be compromised. So, I feel like I've pretty thoroughly gone through my gripes when it comes to this current online-focused era of racing games. However, whilst that describes the problems we face with these games in current day, there are even bigger ones that we'll have to deal with in the future. The main issue with games now being so reliant on online systems is what happens when they go offline. And I don't mean just temporarily, I mean offline for good. Servers are needed to keep these games running, and they won't be up forever. We've seen this scenario play out for a number of games over the years with varying results. On one end of the spectrum, we have Test Drive Unlimited 1 and 2. Now being older games, an online connection wasn't integral to them working, but it still played a part. The social aspect of these games was very prominent, as in them you were able to share the open world sandbox with many other players, and interact with them in various ways. However, even with this being the case, you were never forced to be online to play these games. That concept hadn't really become so widespread as yet. So when you weren't connected to the internet, the map was instead populated with NPC drivers, and when the servers eventually went offline, this became its permanent state. Of course, coming back to play these games now, it is a bit of a shame since there are various modes and features that no longer work, but the bulk of the game still thankfully remains intact. Now let's compare this to the recently released TDU Solar Crown. Of course, you have to be connected to the internet to play it, there is no choice. I mean, it's not as if the servers will ever have any problems, so what's the big deal? The always online integration also causes issues in other ways. My personal favourite being that you can't pause the game in race events, even when you're just racing against AI. But my biggest concern is for the future of this game when it meets its inevitable fate, that being the server shutdown. Think about it, an open-world racing game with a massive emphasis on player interactions being rendered totally unplayable. That might sound like an overreaction, but as we found out earlier this year, it is very much possible. The Crew was an open-world racing game that came out back in 2014, and like many games from the time, it was built around an always-online model. The reason for this was that the open world was also a multiplayer sandbox, much like the two TDU games that had come before it. In fact, many of the people who worked at Eden Games, the developers of TDU 1 and 2, were also involved with The Crew. But of course, the main difference with those two aforementioned titles is that you didn't have to be constantly connected to the internet to play them. Now, the main idea for The Crew was centered around player interactions, forming crews with other players and completing various races and missions. From this perspective, the need to be always online could be seen as integral to the experience. The game was billed as an MMO racing game, but the reality of the game was a bit different. The Crew actually had an entire single-player story that could be completed with virtually no involvement from other players. This meant that, depending on how you played the game, you could have as much or as little online interaction as you wanted. And so, for players who didn't prioritize the multiplayer aspects, the always online requirement was totally unnecessary, and only served to make the experience worse. This was one of the things the game was criticized for at the time, with server issues often causing poor performance or even preventing people from playing the game. Again, not exactly a win when it comes to online integration, but much worse was yet to come. In March of this year, the Crew servers were shut down, and with them went the ability to play the game at all. No attempts were made by publishers Ubisoft to make the game function offline, and things were only made worse a few days later when they then started actively removing the game from people's libraries. This was a massive story at the time, and I'm sure you're probably all aware of it already. You don't need me to tell you how much of a bad precedent this sets, not just for consumer rights, but games preservation as well. Regardless of what you thought about The Crew, I think we can all agree that the prospect of it never being played by anyone ever again is a pretty depressing thought. What's even more frustrating is that it just simply wasn't necessary. They had basically nothing to gain by doing this. People have even found leftovers for an offline mode in the game that was never used, proving that this was a very deliberate decision rather than one of necessity. One theory for why they did this is that it was simply to try and funnel more players into the game's sequels, The Crew 2 and The Crew Motorfest. But when you consider how little they had to gain from doing this, versus the massive reputational damage that's now been done to the series, there is simply no justification. Ubisoft really weren't lacking in reasons for people to hate them, but I suppose it's nice to have one more. Frankly, this wasn't just a massive insult to us as players, but a massive insult to video games as a medium. For as much as I complain about some current racing games, I would never want to see any of them become unplayable in the future. It's crazy to see games preservation still being such a prevalent issue in current day, but thankfully I don't think most other companies are as foolish as Ubisoft in that respect. However, games preservation is not just about keeping games playable, but playable in the same state. When we consider this aspect, online integration brings even more insidious problems. The situation with The Crew drew comparisons to Gran Turismo Sport, which had its servers shut down just a couple of months earlier. Despite it too requiring a constant online connection for most modes, the game was given one final update which allowed the single-player portion of it to still be played post-shutdown. You could argue that this should have been the case from the start, but I suppose it's still a lot better than the alternative. Of course, the fact that Sport mode is no longer playable in GT Sport is kind of funny in a tragic way, but that's just the nature of online gaming. The only solution would be for them to keep the servers running indefinitely, but that obviously was never going to happen. However, there is one aspect of GT Sport that I think was really short-sighted given its inevitable demise. You see, this game brought one of the most requested features to Gran Turismo for the first time: a livery editor. This is something that their rivals Forza Motorsport had from the beginning, so it was great to finally see it in GT. But when the servers went offline, it exposed one massive issue with how liveries were implemented into GT Sport compared to most other racing games. Because instead of livery data saving locally to your console's hard drive, it was all saved to the servers. So when those servers were switched off, all custom livery data was removed from the game. Obviously, you lost access to any designs you downloaded from other players, but you could also no longer see any liveries that you may have created yourself. Even in replays saved prior to the shutdown, all cars, racing suits, and helmets revert to their default color schemes. What makes this even worse is that the livery editor itself no longer functions. So not only can you not create any new liveries, you can't even do basic things like change the color of your car or fit custom wheels. The point about custom wheels is especially strange, since they still remain on any cars you fitted them to prior to the server shutdown, but as that function was tied in with the livery editor, they can't be changed again. It's quite bizarre. For me, this all shows that, whilst they did care about preserving the game to some degree, unlike Ubisoft, they really didn't care that much. Because if they truly did, they A, wouldn't have made this decision in the first place, and B, would have at least made the livery editor accessible after the shutdown, even if all livery data from before then would have been erased anyway. But the cynical side of my brain knows why they most likely didn't do this. Because if you want to play a Gran Turismo game with a livery editor, that means your only option is their current product, Gran Turismo 7. Before GT Sport's servers went down, you were able to import your livery data from that game to GT7, so I think it's quite clear what they're trying to do. And ultimately, a few years down the line, we'll see the exact same situation in Gran Turismo 8, as GT7's livery data is also saved in the same way. So unless something changes, the cycle will just keep repeating itself. It's worth noting that GT Sport had another feature called the Mileage Exchange. It was a place where you could exchange mileage points for various items, including unique cars. But as it was also nuked when the servers were shut off, this means that the handful of original safety cars and Group 3 and Group B road cars are now completely inaccessible unless you have them already. Once again, if you want to get them, you have no choice but to play GT7. Now, compared to the situation with the crew, these issues probably seem trivial to many of you, and whilst the impact is nowhere near as catastrophic, I think that's exactly why stuff like this needs to be put under a bigger spotlight. Because for as much backlash as there was with the crew, I feel like not many people really consider these lower profile cases, which are actually a lot more common. When coming back to games like this years down the line, the experience will be noticeably different to how it was back when the game was still supported. Not only will it be less enjoyable from a casual perspective, but there's also a major historical impact. Like I said, GT Sport was the first game in the series to feature a livery editor. It was a big deal, but now said livery editor is totally inaccessible. From a retrospective standpoint, it's simply a nightmare. Here's another example you've probably not thought about. Forza has a feature known as the auction house. The idea for it is that rather than selling cars for a generic price set by the game, it's instead dictated by the players through what they're willing to actually pay for each car. In that way, it functions much like the real-world car market, at least in theory. As it involves player interaction, naturally this isn't something that can continue to work once the plug is pulled. However, as there are no other real means of selling cars in these games, they can either be sold for next to nothing or simply just discarded, this presents a bit of a problem. It means that in the older games that have long since been shut down, you're straight up unable to sell cars. And when we talk about the Horizon games, for example, where winning random cars through wheel spins is very common, not being able to sell them is quite a pain, because now you're just stuck with a bunch of cars you don't want or may already have. Again, it's not a massive problem, but considering how basic a feature selling cars is, this is yet another case of them both lacking the foresight to see these issues, and then not really caring to rectify them once the game goes offline. I mean, do you remember the outrage with not being able to sell cars in GT7, and the fact that it took them several months to finally add it as a feature? Well, for almost every single Forza title, that's just the fate they're doomed to by design. But speaking of Gran Turismo, the first mainline game in the series to feature online connectivity was Gran Turismo 5. GT5 is often seen as a dip in quality compared to the games that came before it, and there were numerous reasons why, but one of them was its unbalanced single-player experience. There simply weren't enough events to do, and thus ways to earn money and prize cars, versus the sheer amount of cars in the game, including some that were ludicrously expensive. And given that most of the cars could only be found in the limited rotation of the used car dealership, this resulted in a very frustrating experience where your ability to get many of the best cars was completely out of your own hands. It was a massive dilemma for car collectors. Fortunately, Polyphony realized these issues as well and soon came up with some fixes which they would add through updates. There were seasonal events, a rotating selection of unique races, time trials, and drift trials that offered large rewards. There was also the Online Collectors Dealership, or OCD, which stocked a selection of the more rare and desirable cars that were difficult to find in the used car dealership. Whilst these weren't perfect solutions, they were welcome additions that did improve the player experience. But when GT5 servers were shut down in 2014, this once again exposed a critical issue. Because despite the seasonal events and OCD not really involving any multiplayer elements, both became unusable after the shutdown. In both cases, this was because they functioned on a manual rotation that required them to be regularly updated with new events and different cars on a bi-weekly basis. The end result is that when playing GT5 in current day, it's as if the issues were never addressed at all. With just a bit more effort, they easily could have found ways to implement these two features so that they could continue to function after the shutdown, but they just didn't bother. It's yet another example of these online aspects leading to short-sighted decision making. You might be sitting there thinking, well, why should they care? The game had run its course by that point. But for me, that ignores the wider issue. Think about it like this. The golden era of racing games that often gets talked about mostly centers around the 2000s. This was a time that many people would agree is when a lot of the all-time greats came out. However, why do we rate these games so highly? Is it because we simply enjoy them more than anything that's come since? Sure, but I don't think that's the full story. This was an era before any of these limited time online features were really a thing. Games were designed to be fully functional games from the moment they released until the end of time. The impact of this is that we can go back to these games in current day and have the exact same experience that we did all those years ago. This is something that I feel doesn't get appreciated enough, because it's this fact that gives these games their lasting appeal. They will continue to be just as good as they always were. Think about Gran Turismo 4. This is a 20-year-old game that many consider as one of those true greats. But what's important is that it didn't earn that reputation overnight. It took many years for the game to be fully appreciated, to the point where it still has a large player base even today. And that's why there's been so much excitement about a mod that doesn't fundamentally change it, but instead tweaks it into an even better experience. And to be honest, it's not unique in that sense. You could say the same thing about the other classic Gran Turismos and many more racing games from the time as well. I can almost guarantee that 20 years on from now, people will still be playing these games. But will anyone be playing Gran Turismo 7, or Forza Horizon 5, or the Crew Motorfest? Assuming that's even still possible, no. Why would they? They're clearly not designed to have the longevity of those older titles, and that's why they ultimately feel hollow. Because even though you can enjoy them as the latest new and shiny things, you always know in the back of your mind that it's not long until they're replaced with something even newer and shinier. And then it'll become even more obvious just how lacking in substance they really are. The way I think about it is that these older games are like a good meal. You can keep coming back to them time after time and always enjoy them in the same way. Whereas a lot of these newer racing games, with their live service design elements and temporary online features, are more like chewing gum. They have a pleasant flavor at first, but it always runs out eventually. In a word, they're disposable. And just to be clear, I am aware of the work that's being done by people to keep supporting these games even when they go offline. It's been really impressive to see the efforts that have been made to resurrect lost features, game modes, and even entire games. But ultimately, this doesn't excuse these design decisions. It shouldn't be left up to the community to right these wrongs. As a racing game fan, it kills me inside. In other genres, we still see these well-crafted single-player experiences that go on to critical acclaim. So how come it's no longer possible when it just involves driving? What did we do to deserve this? Well, I think I know why. The reason why the racing game genre seems to suffer with this problem more than any other is because of the commercial aspect. Most racing games use real-life cars and sometimes tracks. The unfortunate byproduct of this is that they have a limited shelf life, given that the licenses for these cars and tracks will only last for a handful of years. After that, the game can no longer be sold. If I had to guess, I think that knowing this, most companies choose these online models as a way of maximizing the limited lifespan of the game. Of course, we do see these models in other genres as well, but given that they don't have to deal with this sort of licensing, those games can continue to be sold indefinitely. This means that, compared to the racing genre, it's more worthwhile to invest in a high-quality single-player focused game, because the developers and publishers can continue to profit from it long into the future. For most racing games, that's just not the case. If it takes several years for a game to be fully appreciated, like we've seen with GT4 or Forza Horizon 1 for example, that doesn't financially benefit the creators in any way. And to me, that's why instead of trying to emulate these older games with their long-lasting appeal, they instead focus on the short term. Because whether these newer games will still be enjoyable to play in 10 or 20 years simply does not matter to them. I believe this is the core reason why modern racing games have become online-centric, disposable products. Of course, every game is different, and that's not to say that there are no interesting single-player focused racing games, but when it comes to the major players in the market, this is the reality we now live in. And if nothing changes, they'll just keep choosing to make the same mistakes.